My parents gave my old room to my cousin without even telling me. When I came home from college, my stuff was in trash bags. Now they want me to come home for the holidays. I think I'll pass. The first thing I noticed was the smell. It no longer smelled like home. The scent of worn wood, old books, and faint lavender, my mother's signature cleaning touch, had been replaced by something cold, clinical, and dispassionate. It was the metallic tang of new paint and the sterile flatness of air that had been left to circulate through an empty, indifferent house. Dragging my suitcase behind me, I tried to shake off the growing unease blooming in my chest, telling myself that months away could distort familiar spaces. That memory could often romanticize the mundane into myth. I crossed the threshold with a hesitant hope still clutching my heart like a fragile trinket, yearning to find everything just as I had left it. Proof that no matter how far I had traveled, no matter how much I had changed, there remained a constant, a sanctuary. But the instant my footfalls echoed through the hall, that hope withered. My gaze was drawn immediately to the open door of what used to be my room, now grotesquely altered. The walls once plastered with band posters, college pennants, and the battered corkboard heavy with mementos were now stark and foreign, painted a pallid beige that seemed to erase every trace of who I had been. Inside, an unfamiliar figure lounged across my old bed, a cousin I barely knew, her laughter shrill against the hollow walls as she scrolled on her phone without a glance at me. Her luggage sat proudly where my bookshelf used to be, and in the corner, like the discarded carcass of some animal long since forgotten, lay a collection of trash bags slumped against each other, bulging obscenely with the possessions that had once formed the architecture of my childhood. At first, my body did not react. I stood there, suspended between disbelief and numbness, while the world spun itself further and further away from me. It was only when I stepped closer, when I saw the frayed corner of my old sketchbook peeking from one of the torn bags, that something inside me crumbled. I dropped to my knees, my fingers trembling as I dug through the disarray. There were the trophies I had won in high school debate, dented and scratched. There were the photos I had taken of my friends before graduation, their frames shattered. There was the worn, battered teddy bear that had survived every storm of my youth, now matted and crushed under the weight of forgotten sweaters and tangled cords. Each item I uncovered was a small funeral, a tiny eulogy to a life I had so carefully built within these walls, a life my parents had deemed disposable without even the courtesy of a warning. I clutched the sketchbook to my chest and stumbled backward, the rough texture of the carpet scraping my knees through my jeans. Only then did my mother appear in the doorway, her face arranged into an expression that was more inconvenience than concern. "Oh, you're home," she said, as if my arrival were an unexpected interruption rather than something they should have anticipated with open arms and waiting smiles. "Don't make a scene. Your cousin needed a place to stay. You're off at college now. You don't live here anymore." Her words hit harder than any blow could have, the callousness behind them a brutal severance of the lifeline I had held onto for so long. I opened my mouth, desperate to find some articulation for the betrayal clawing at my ribs, but only a broken, strangled sound emerged. My father, drawn by the noise, appeared beside her, arms crossed, face lined with impatience. "We didn't think it was such a big deal," he said, voice clipped with finality. "Your stuff's all there. You can go through it later. Don't be so dramatic." The dismissal in their eyes was a weight pressing down on my chest, a final, inarguable proof that whatever place I thought I held here had been an illusion. They had not only replaced me physically, they had erased me emotionally, mentally, spiritually. I was a guest now in the house I had grown up in, a stranger trespassing on what had once been my sanctuary. I spent the night in the basement, curled up on an old couch that smelled of mildew and dust, too proud to ask for a hotel room and too heartbroken to sleep. The walls around me seemed to close in, filled with the ghosts of 100,000 moments I had once cherished. Birthday parties, tearful teenage confessions, whispered dreams of the future that now seemed laughable in their naivety. In the dim silence, I realized something cold and immutable. They had shown me, with brutal clarity, that their love had conditions, and I had failed to meet them by daring to grow beyond the borders they had drawn around me. When morning came, I packed my things, what little remained unbroken or unsullied, and left without saying goodbye. My parents called once or twice over the next few weeks, The messages clipped and increasingly irritated when I did not respond. They treated my silence like an inconvenience, an immaturity I would surely outgrow once I had gotten over myself. But I didn't call back. I couldn't. Some bridges, once burned, do not leave paths back, only ashes scattered to winds that no longer carry you home. Months passed, and the seasons turned without ceremony. Fall surrendered to winter, and with it came the inevitable invitation, or more accurately, the summons. My phone lit up with my mother's name, her text a grotesque parody of normalcy. "Can't wait to see you for Christmas. Your room's ready." No acknowledgement of what had happened. No apology. Just a blind expectation that I would slide back into the role they had crafted for me. The grateful child, the obedient prodigal, the accommodating satellite orbiting the massive gravity of their self-centered world. I stared at the message for a long time, my fingers poised above the screen, feeling a familiar ache rising in my chest. For so long, I had been desperate for their approval, craving their pride as if it were the air I breathed, measuring my worth by the faint smiles and rare nods of satisfaction they doled out. Every late-night study session, every grueling exam, every meticulously written essay had been a prayer sent into the void, begging them to see me, to value me, to say I mattered. And yet, here I stood, finally understanding the bitter truth. No accolade, no achievement, no self-sacrifice would ever be enough to secure what they refused to offer freely. This time, I chose differently. I closed the message without responding, each second that passed an act of quiet, defiant liberation. I would not walk back into that house, that mausoleum of broken promises and casual cruelty. I would not set another place at a table where my presence had been replaced before the seat had cooled. I would not wear the mask of the dutiful child, the easy scapegoat for their shortcomings and failures to love unconditionally. Instead, I would stay in the small apartment I had worked so hard to afford, surrounded by the books, the paintings, the friends who had chosen me when blood had not. I would decorate my own tree, fill my own cupboards with the foods I loved, and celebrate the season on my own terms. I would build a home not of walls and memories dictated by others, but of my own design, a home where my existence was not something to be shoved into trash bags and forgotten when inconvenient. And for the first time in my life, the thought of spending the holidays alone did not terrify me. It empowered me. Because solitude, when chosen, is not loneliness. It is freedom. A freedom they had never given me, but one I had finally learned to claim for myself. The days melted into one another with a sluggishness that both dulled and sharpened the ache in my chest, a paradox of pain that no longer came in stabbing bursts, but instead settled into a low, endless hum beneath my ribs. I moved through my routines as if underwater, each action muffled by the heavy weight of things unsaid, by the ghosts of expectations I could no longer force myself to meet. My apartment, though small and worn at the edges, began to feel less like a temporary refuge and more like a sovereign land, a place untouched by the casual brutality of those who had once claimed to love me most. Here, the walls carried no memories of betrayal. Here, the furniture bore only the imprints of my own choosing. The curtains hung just slightly askew by my own clumsy hands. The kitchen filled with the faint scent of cinnamon from the candles I burned at odd hours to chase away the hollow vastness of winter nights. Outside, the city draped itself in a coat of gray, the sidewalks slick with half-melted snow, the air sharp enough to sting the skin and set the lungs ablaze with every breath. People hurried by in thick coats and knitted scarves, heads bowed against the wind, their faces set in grim masks of purpose. I watched them from my window sometimes, a silent observer of lives rushing onward, lives that did not pause for heartbreak or familial abandonment. There was something oddly comforting in the anonymity, in the understanding that the world did not expect anything from me here. I owed no one an explanation for my absence at a holiday table. I owed no apology for my refusal to return to a place that had proven itself hostile to my existence. Still, the ache was not so easily banished. It crept in during the quiet moments, during the pauses between tasks when there was nothing left to distract me. It whispered doubts into the crevices of my mind, insidious and persistent. Had I overreacted? Was I truly so ungrateful, so unforgiving? The voice sounded so much like my mother's that sometimes I startled, half expecting to see her reflection in the window instead of my own weary face. But I reminded myself over and over with a quiet ferocity that hurt does not make itself up. Pain is not a hallucination. It leaves marks, even when invisible, carving rivers through the soul that no apology, no half-hearted invitation to Christmas dinner could ever truly mend. They had made a choice, and now, so had I. Despite the steel I tried to build around my heart, December's advance brought with it a relentless tide of memories. I remembered the Christmas mornings of my childhood, the way I would race down the stairs with bare feet, the sharp chill of the hardwood floor biting into my soles, the sight of the living room transformed overnight into a wonderland of glittering lights and neatly wrapped presents. I remembered the way my parents' faces had looked back then, softened by the flickering glow of the fireplace, their eyes crinkled with genuine smiles, not yet weighted by judgment and expectation. Somewhere along the way, that warmth had calcified into something cold and transactional, but the memory of its former tenderness clung to me stubbornly, like frost refusing to yield to the morning sun. I made a half-hearted attempt at decorating my apartment, stringing a tangled line of lights around the window and hanging a cheap wreath on the door. The effort felt both pitiful and defiant, a child's attempt at imitation, but I persisted. I bought a small artificial tree from the discount store, dragging it home through the slush with numbed fingers and a determination that bordered on desperation. It stood crookedly in the corner of my living room, its branches sparse and its needles shedding onto the carpet like broken promises. Still, I adorned it with ornaments scavenged from second-hand shops and dollar bins, each one chosen not for its price or perfection, but for the small spark of joy it ignited in me. One evening, as I hung the last of the baubles, a ceramic snowflake chipped at the edges, I realized that I was crying. Silent, unbidden tears traced cold paths down my cheeks, dripping from my chin onto the floor. I did not wipe them away. I let them fall, a baptism of grief and healing, a silent acknowledgement of everything I had lost and everything I was slowly, painfully, building anew. The invitations from my parents continued to come, first in the form of texts, then voicemails, and finally emails when it became clear that I had no intention of responding. Their tone shifted with each attempt, moving from casual to pleading to passive-aggressively accusatory. My mother wrote that the family missed me, that it would break her heart to have an empty seat at the table. My father reminded me of traditions I was selfishly abandoning, as if the very act of reclaiming my dignity was a betrayal greater than the one they had committed against me. I read each message with a numb detachment, feeling less like the intended recipient and more like an anthropologist studying an ancient alien culture. I recognized the tactics now, the emotional blackmail, the weaponized guilt, but they no longer found easy purchase in the soil of my heart. The roots had been severed, the soil had turned to stone. Still, their persistence gnawed at the edges of my resolve. I found myself staring into the mirror one night, searching my reflection for signs of the villain they seemed to think I had become. But all I saw was a young woman carrying the weight of her own survival, her eyes tired but unbroken, her shoulders bowed but unbent. No monster stared back at me, only the battered, stubborn core of someone who had finally chosen herself over a family who had never truly chosen her. The city prepared itself for the holidays with a grim enthusiasm. Storefronts flashed with garish lights, the streets clogged with shoppers wrapped in layers of exhaustion and expectation. Carolers braved the cold in mismatched scarves and mittens, their voices thin against the rising winds. Couples clung to each other in doorways, laughter steaming in the frigid air. It should have been beautiful. It should have been magical. But to me, it all felt like a distant play performed for an audience I no longer belonged to. One evening, driven by an ache I could neither name nor soothe, I wandered into a bookstore tucked away on a side street, its windows fogged and its sign swinging precariously in the gusts. Inside, the warmth hit me like a physical blow, heavy with the scent of paper and ink and something sweeter, like cloves or cinnamon. The aisles were narrow, the shelves overstuffed, and I lost myself among them gratefully, running my fingers along the spines of novels, histories, poetry collections. Here, among the quiet wisdom of strangers long gone, I found a strange solace. I ended up in the back corner, in a section labeled simply Letters. There, tucked between thick volumes of correspondence from long-dead philosophers and battered anthologies of wartime missives, I found a thin, battered book titled Letters to the Ones Who Left. The cover was plain, the pages yellowed, but something in the title snagged at the ragged edges of my heart. I bought it without thinking, clutching it to my chest like a talisman as I made my way back through the swirling snow. That night, curled up in my battered armchair with a mug of tea cooling at my elbow, I opened the book. Inside were dozens of letters, some long, some achingly brief, written by people who had been abandoned, betrayed, forgotten. Each one was a small, searing fragment of grief and resilience, a testimony to the terrible, beautiful human capacity to endure. I read them all in one sitting, the words sinking into me like seeds into fertile ground. When I closed the book at last, my hands trembling slightly, I realized that I was not alone in my sorrow. Others had been cast adrift by those they trusted most. Others had rebuilt themselves from the wreckage. If they could survive, so could I. The holidays arrived with an indifferent inevitability. I did not respond to my parents' final, frantic calls. I did not explain myself, did not justify my absence. I owed them no such courtesy. Not anymore. Instead, I spent Christmas morning wrapped in a blanket on my couch, sipping coffee from a chipped mug, watching the gray light spill through the frosted windows. I opened a small gift I had bought for myself. A delicate silver ring engraved with a phrase in a language I did not speak but whose meaning I understood instinctively. I am my own shelter. It was not the Christmas I had imagined as a child. It was not filled with laughter or the chaotic warmth of family. But it was real. It was mine. And somewhere deep inside, in a place still tender and raw, I began to believe that maybe, just maybe, that was enough. Winter wore on with a stubborn bleakness that seemed determined to grind even the strongest spirits down to ash. The days were short and anemic, the sun offering only the briefest, coldest glimpses of itself before sinking once more beneath a horizon the color of dirty snow. My small apartment became my sanctuary, my fortress against a world that still spun on heedlessly, against memories that still sometimes ambushed me when I least expected. But inside these walls, I shaped something new each day, something fragile yet tenacious, like the first shoots of green daring to push through frozen soil. The silence from my parents eventually settled into something like permanence. After their last few unanswered pleas and their final, predictably bitter message about my stubbornness, they simply stopped trying. No more calls, no more texts, no more apologies that had never really been apologies. I had not just left their house behind, I had become invisible to them. A ghost of someone who had once belonged but had failed to follow the script they had written in invisible ink across my skin. At first, the quiet left a hollow ache, a space where love should have been, where even anger might have lived. But slowly, so imperceptibly that I barely noticed it happening, that hollow space began to fill, not with the manufactured affections of obligation, but with the solid, real foundations of self-respect and hard-won peace. The more distance I put between myself and the people who had thrown me away so easily, the more I saw the shape of who I could become without their expectations constraining me like iron shackles. It was not easy. Healing never is. There were nights when loneliness clawed at me, nights when the sight of families laughing together in a restaurant window could unravel me into a mess of grief and bitterness. There were mornings when I woke up half expecting the smell of my mother's cinnamon rolls or the sound of my father arguing with the television over politics. There were moments when I would catch myself picking up the phone, fingers hovering over their numbers, a primal yearning inside me for a forgiveness they had never asked for and would never truly offer. But I never pressed call. Instead, I pressed forward. I threw myself into my classes, into work, into building a life that, while not always easy or perfect, was wholly mine. I volunteered at the local library, rediscovering my love for stories and the quiet, steady pulse of community. I made friends who saw me, not as a daughter to be judged, but as a person in her own right, flawed, brilliant, human. People who laughed with me in grocery store aisles, who held me when the weight of memory threatened to drag me under, who celebrated my victories with a ferocity that felt all the more precious because it was freely given. By spring, the city began to thaw, shedding its icy armor in bursts of wet sidewalks and tentative blossoms. The change in the air seemed to seep into my very bones, awakening a restlessness I had not realized had taken root inside me during the long, gray months. I found myself walking longer routes home from work, lingering in parks as children tumbled across muddy fields, their shrieks of laughter like music against the thawing world. I began to dream, not of returning to what I had lost, but of building something better. One evening, as the sun sank in a haze of pale gold behind the crumbling skyline, I found myself standing before a narrow, worn-down townhouse sandwiched between two towering modern apartment buildings. Its red bricks were chipped and faded, its front step cracked, its window boxes overflowing with weeds. It was, by any reasonable measure, a wreck. But I stood there for a long time, staring at it, feeling something stir deep inside me. A recognition. A pull. It needed work. It needed love. Much like me. Without fully understanding why, I found myself researching how to buy it, how to navigate the labyrinth of loans and paperwork. The process was grueling, filled with more obstacles than I could have anticipated. There were moments when I wanted to give up, to retreat back into the safer, smaller life I had carved out for myself. But I pushed forward, fueled not by stubbornness, but by the conviction that I deserved something more than survival. I deserved roots. I deserved walls that could hold my laughter, my grief, my hopes, walls that no one could take away from me or shove aside when it became inconvenient. When the day finally came to sign the papers, I sat in the sterile office with a pen trembling in my hand, tears blurring the words before me. But when I pressed the pen to paper, when I etched my name across the final line, I felt something inside me snap free. A tether I had not realized still bound me to the past unraveled, falling away like dead vines from a flourishing tree. The house was mine. The first night I spent there, I slept on a mattress laid directly on the scuffed wooden floor, wrapped in a sleeping bag, the heater groaning in protest against the still lingering chill. The wind howled through cracks in the windows, and the faint sound of distant traffic drifted through the thin walls. It should have felt lonely. It should have felt cold. But as I lay there staring at the cracked ceiling, I realized I was smiling, because for the first time, I was not waiting for someone else to welcome me home. I was already home. Over the next weeks and months, I poured myself into restoring the house. My hands blistered from sanding floors and scraping old paint, my knees bruised from hours spent crouched to fix baseboards and tile. Every nail I hammered, every board I replaced, every window I washed clean, was a reclamation, a declaration. With each swing of the hammer, with each stroke of the brush, I rewrote the story of my life, not as the daughter abandoned, but as the woman who built something beautiful from the ruins. When I finished the living room, I hung a single picture above the fireplace, a photograph of myself taken by a friend on a random Saturday afternoon. I was laughing, utterly unguarded, sunlight catching in my hair, my eyes bright with a joy that owed nothing to anyone else's approval. It was a reminder, a promise to myself, that I would never again trade my happiness for someone else's comfort. As the seasons turned, as spring gave way to summer and summer to the crisp bite of autumn, I grew into my new life. I hosted small dinners with friends who brought mismatched chairs and stories to share. I sat on the front stoop on cool evenings, sipping coffee and watching the world spin by. I decorated for the holidays, with no expectation other than the quiet delight of crafting traditions that belonged solely to me. My parents never came to see the house. They never asked about it, never sent a card, never reached out again. And though there was a time when that silence would have broken me, now it was simply a fact, like the color of the sky or the phases of the moon. I no longer mistook their absence for a wound. It was simply space. Space I had filled with better things. Years later, standing at the threshold of that little red brick house, a mug of steaming tea cradled in my hands, I watched as the first snow of the season began to fall. The flakes caught in the hair of the neighbors' children as they played, their laughter ringing out into the gathering dusk. The streetlights flickered on one by one, casting halos of golden light onto the softening world. I smiled to myself, a smile not born of bitterness or triumph, but of simple, profound peace. The girl who had once stood in her childhood home, staring at her life packed into trash bags, no longer lived here. The woman who built her own home, who chose herself when no one else would, did.